Hello, and welcome to part 2 of the first Kant module. After this module, there's also a module on objections. This module will cover the application of Kant's deontological theory. As mentioned before, the key to understanding the application of Kant's deontology is the categorical imperative. In order to understand the categorical imperative, though, you must first understand what an imperative is. There are two types of imperatives: hypothetical imperatives and categorical imperatives. For the sake of Kant's theory, it is the categorical imperative that is important, but it is easier to understand Kant's categorical imperative if you first understand what a hypothetical imperative is. Hypothetical imperatives. A hypothetical imperative is a command of reason that only applies in order to achieve some hypothetically desired end. If you want X, then Y. The hypothetical portion can be thought of as wanting X, and the imperative portion can be thought of as the Y part of the statement. Examples: if you want a valid California driver's license, you must pass the driver's test. If you want your friends to think you are polite, then you need to cover your mouth and nose when you sneeze. You must take your antibiotics if you want to cure your illness. Notice that if you want to drive legally in California, then reason demands that you pass the driving test. That is to say, that if you will yourself to drive legally, then you also must will yourself to pass the driver's test, get a license, and so on. But also notice that reason doesn't demand that you take the driver's test, period. If you do not care about driving, or do not care about driving legally, then you are not willing something that also requires you to will passing the driving test. The hypothetical imperative, then, is a command of reason that only applies when you want the hypothetical to hold true. But if you want to will one, you must also rationally will the other. The categorical imperative is different because the categorical imperative is a command of reason that applies no matter what the situation is and no matter what you want. For Kant, there's only one categorical imperative, but he puts it in several forms. We will look at two of these forms. The categorical imperative is absolutely required for morality. It is a command of reason. It is also important to note that failure to follow the categorical imperative is the failure of rationality. Both versions of the categorical imperative amount to being able to universalize whatever rational principle you act upon, though only one version directly mentions universalization. Categorical imperative version 1 says, "Always act as if the maxim of your action were to become by your will a universal law of nature." Translation: only act on those guiding principles or rules that can be rationally willed to be rules followed as if they were laws of nature by every other person. In other words, willing an act is permissible if and only if you could will the general rule behind your action to be followed by everyone, everywhere, all the time. This means both that willing the maxim universally would not cause a contradiction, and it is something a rational being is actually capable of willing. Here is an example Kant actually used. Suppose that you are wondering whether it is morally permissible or not to lie about your intention to pay back a loan so that you can borrow money without paying it back. Now, of course, we know that just about any ethical theory is going to say that this is wrong. The point here is to explain why doing this would be wrong under Kant's deontology. What is the reasoning? Not all theories would say that this is wrong for the same reason. Here's the way to test for morality using version 1 of the categorical imperative. There are 3 basic steps. Step 1. Ask yourself, what is the guiding maxim or rule of the action? Maybe it is something like this: whenever one wants money, it is permissible to say that you will pay back a loan, but not pay it back. Step 2 then is to universalize the rule. Imagine that everybody who borrows money now is lying about their intention to pay it back. All people who want money now try to borrow money this way just as surely as they obey the law of gravity. It is like a law of nature, no exceptions. Now, what would happen to the practice of loaning money? Either nobody would loan money anymore because they know that they will not be repaid, or the phrase "can I borrow $10" would now just come to mean, will you give me $10? So now we ask, step 3, is this maxim universalizable? As we can see from above, if your own maxim, rule, or principle were universalized, it would be impossible for you to fool somebody into loaning you money by lying to them, either because nobody would loan you money, or because everybody would know that there is no intention to pay it back, so you wouldn't be fooling them. Thus, the action you are considering contradicts your own maxim or principle. This means that your maxim or principle is irrational and therefore immoral. Conclusion: since the maxim cannot be universalized, because it runs into a contradiction if universalized, it violates the categorical imperative and is immoral. Okay, you should remember the previous steps for applying the universalizing formula of the categorical imperative. Let's apply them again to the following case. Suppose you're wondering if it's okay to take somebody else's property, that is to say, whether or not it is okay to steal. Once again, here is the method for testing the first version of the categorical imperative. We are testing whether or not stealing is morally permissible. Step 1 is to determine the maxim or guiding rule or principle behind the action. Maybe it is something like this: when I want something that belongs to somebody else, I can just take it. Step 2 is to universalize the rule. Imagine that everybody who wants something from somebody else always just takes it. There are no exceptions to this. All people do it just as if it were a law of nature. A law of nature just like gravity, for example. Gravity affects everybody everywhere, no exceptions. Now, if this were universalized, like a law of nature, what would happen to the concept of property rights? Since everybody takes the property of others whenever they want property, property just becomes whatever one can hold on to. Step 3 is to ask if this maxim is universalizable. Is it consistent, and can we will it? In this case, the answer is no. This maxim cannot be universalized because if property rights do not exist, then stealing, violating property rights, is impossible. You both can't make something your own property by stealing it because nobody else would have a concept of your property, and you cannot steal something nobody understands themselves to own. So the conclusion is that the maxim that allows for stealing runs into a contradiction if universalized, and so violates the categorical imperative and is therefore immoral. Example 3. Sometimes an immoral maxim doesn't result in a direct contradiction, but is still unwillable by a rational being, according to Kant. Such motives are also immoral. Consider the following. Suppose you are wondering if it is okay to refuse to help others who your help would greatly benefit, even though it would be of little cost to you. You are essentially going to be an egoist. You are not going to ask anybody for help, and you are not going to help anybody else. Kant uses the example of somebody who has great wealth while others are suffering in poverty. Again, we will apply the test for the universalizing version of the categorical imperative. The question is only looking after your own interests, when you have the ability to help others, moral? Step 1. What is the guiding maxim or rule of the action? Maybe it is something like this: everybody should look out for himself or herself and be responsible for himself or herself only. Step 2 is to universalize the rule. So imagine that everybody obeys this maxim as if it were a law of nature. The next step, step 3, is to ask if we can universalize it. There are two things we need to ask. First, can we universalize it without a direct contradiction? Yes, we can imagine such a world without a contradiction. Note, we might not think that we would like such a world. In this case, such a world would be pretty nasty. But that isn't the issue for Kant. Remember that Kant doesn't care about consequences, so whether or not we like the outcome isn't important. What is important is that there is no contradiction or logical conflict here yet. But next, call it step 3.5, we need to ask if a rational being can actually will this maxim or principle. Kant says that this maxim is still not willable, because it is impossible, not logically but psychologically, For a person to be in a situation where she or he desperately needs help from somebody who is able to help easily, and not rationally will that person should do so. So, though there is no contradiction, the maxim still cannot be universally willed by rational beings. Conclusion: the maxim is psychologically unwillable, and is therefore irrational and immoral. There is a second version of the categorical imperative. The first version of the categorical imperative involves a rather complicated process of determining whether the rule of an action involves either a contradiction or is, for some other reason, impossible to will for a rational being. Kant provides another version of the categorical imperative that is, in most cases, more intuitive and easier to put to work. So here is the second version of the categorical imperative. This is called the kingdom of ends formulation, as opposed to the universalizing formulation. Act as to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or in that of any others, in every case as an end withal, and never as a means to an end only. Or to put it another way, always will to act in a way that treats all people as ultimately valuable themselves, and never just use them as a means to some other end, and this includes yourself. But what does all this mean? Let's unpack it together. Again, here is our paraphrasing. Always will to act in a way that treats all people as ultimately valuable themselves, and never just use them as a means to some other end. This includes yourself. Now remember our earlier discussion. The good will is the only unconditionally good thing, and it belongs to all rational beings, even if they don't exercise it. Therefore, people are ultimately valuable. Therefore, if I use a person without concern for their will, desires, and so forth, in order to achieve some other end, then I am valuing a lesser good over the ultimate good, over the good of rational will. Basically, this version of the categorical imperative says not to use people as mere tools. Now let's try applying the kingdom of ends formulation of the categorical imperative to an ethical problem. Suppose you are at a garage sale and notice that the woman running the sale is unknowingly selling a painting of great value for just $10. Is it okay to take advantage of her ignorance and buy the painting? Well, doing so is using her as a tool to get the painting only, and does not consider the fact that she is acting on misinformation, thinking that it is a worthless painting by an unknown artist. If she knew what the painting was worth, she wouldn't sell it so cheaply. In other words, she would will differently if fully informed. Keeping her in ignorance to gain money is therefore valuing something of lesser value, mere money, over her will, which is of ultimate value. Valuing something of lesser value over something of greater value is irrational, and thus would be immoral under Kant's theory. Let's try applying the kingdom of ends formulation again with one more example. Suppose that by killing one innocent person you could save two innocent people. Perhaps one innocent person has a liver and a heart that is compatible with two innocents who will not get a donor otherwise. If the first person is killed, they will then both be saved through the use of these organs. Would this be permissible? For Kant, this would be impermissible. It would be impermissible even if the organ saved 100 others. The first person is just being used as a means to another end. But the consequences is not what is morally important under Kant's theory. What is morally important is the good will. Therefore, killing one to save two, or to save 2,000, would be immoral. Important note, this would include even killing yourself to save two others, since the categorical imperative applies to using your own person as a mere means to an end as well. Before moving on, it is important to clarify the phrase, using a person as a means to an end only. It is important to notice the only in the sentence fragment above. It is okay for people to make use of each other's abilities so long as the will of all persons is being fully considered. Thus, there's nothing necessarily wrong with, say, hiring an employee so long as that employee is being treated as a full person, kept fully informed, and so forth. But it is not moral to use an employee or any other person as a mere means to an end, say making money, only, and thus failing to value persons as an ultimate end. You can see here how Kant views humanity as a kingdom of ends, and why this is the kingdom of ends formulation of Kant's categorical imperative. So, to wrap up this section's main points, Kant views the rational or good will, and thus human beings who have this ability, as beings of ultimate value. Note, for Kant, therefore, a human that is too young or with brain damage so severe that she or he cannot be rational would not count as a person in this sense. This is the ultimate good because this kind of rationality is required to follow the concept of a law. Only such beings may freely choose to do their moral duty to the moral law. To be good, one needs to respect these facts about humanity and always do one's moral duty. There are two major ways to test one's will to act. The first is the universalizing formulation of the categorical imperative, and the second is the kingdom of ends formulation of the categorical imperative. And that ends this presentation, but please remember that there is a presentation on objections to Kant's Deontology as well. Also, we will be continuing with Kant in the next module. Until next time.